right. Tuesday night. Welcome. We're glad you're joining tonight. As always, we have a chat box open and live. We do welcome questions. And I guess as we give folks time to kind of filter in, I've been listening to a few books, and a couple of them have talked about some pretty dark times in the United States. And I was just thinking about, you know, the news and things that are happening in our world right now, the riots down in LA and stuff that are, protests and stuff that are turning into riots and looting. And just, I was watching some footage of some of the stuff that's going on down there. And I couldn't help but every time, something like this happens, it's happened quite a few times in the last 10 years, but every time I see something like this, it reminds me of the things I've learned about the time frame of the 1960s in the United States, and just the amount of riots and protests and stuff that were going on during that time. It was kind of a polarizing time in the United States, and honestly a very dark time. Tons of assassinations, and the war in Vietnam was at its height during that time. There's a lot of pretty crazy things happening, and political unrest and scandal. I mean, just if you go through, a history of the 1960s, it was just insane. And honestly, not a ton different than right now. The things that we're facing and seeing happen in our world right now is just insane. Not just in the United States, but just in the world in general. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was listening to a book called Natural Born Heroes, and it's not really a book about heroes per se, but more about guys that had kind of tapped into an innate strength, something that's a part of the biological structure of the human body, and they utilize that to perform feats of endurance and heroics during World War II. There were certain guys that were exemplary during that time. These Cretan descendant guys that and so he's tying a lot of stuff into Greek gods and mythologies and stuff like that of these make-believe heroes. And he makes this statement. He said that heroes are not just people who do great things and die. Real heroes are people who do great things and live. and that just got me to thinking about our opinions of what a hero is and what a hero is not.
Interesting.
And I was kind of processing all of that, and then obviously I finished that book. I started reading into another one. It started talking about the time frame of the 1960s, and he makes this statement about a photo, which I didn't actually know about this photo. I'd seen the photo before. I didn't know the history of it, but this photo during the the Vietnam War was a very different time as far as war is concerned, because media outlets, especially like AP and all these old school media juggernauts at the time, these guys were the ones doing all the hands-on work. They had boots on the ground. They had people there that were actually getting real-time war footage, and they were snapping photos and they were sending them back to the United States. So the people of the United States, the general public, a lot of the world really, were getting images sent to them of what was happening in Vietnam. These very, very graphic photos and stuff like that. Some of these are, award-winning photos, and so you can, spin that however you want and have whatever opinion you want of it. There's one particular photo that came out of a southern Vietnamese general point-blank range executing another soldier on the northern Vietnamese side. And I don't, for time's sake, can't go into all the stuff that was happening in that specific time in Vietnam, but there's a lot of history behind it. But basically, the world saw that, and particularly in the United States, they saw that photo, and it galvanized the anti-war effort. Like, the protests were enhanced, and people were outraged because they saw this. No information, no trial, no official criminal record of what had happened. And all they saw was one guy shooting an unarmed man in the head, execution style. But what they didn't know was that this specific guy had done something very similar to a southern Vietnamese officer's family. Wife, 6 kids, and an 80-year-old mother, execution style, shot all of them and put him in a mass grave. And he was caught at the site of this mass grave. And so the point I'm making in that is it made me think about how an unfortunate byproduct of the media and the world we live in, and the access to bits and pieces of information without having the whole story is that we can draw conclusions and make assumptions on who the heroes are and who the villains are.
Yeah.
That can also play out into just who we criminalize or who we villainize or who we look up to in general. So we get bits and pieces of information and we make up our minds about who the hero is and who the villain is. And unfortunately, we can often be wrong. And so in a time like this, in the world that we live in, there is need for heroes. There's need for people to stand out and do good things and be good men and good women and people that we can look up to and can have, good influence over individuals. And so it made me think about this whole issue of heroes and villains. And I thought, villains is a little bit too Hollywood, a little bit less common. And so the word anti-hero is something I found in just researching some antithesis and opposites of heroes. But an anti-hero is simply somebody who doesn't display the qualities of a hero.
Right.
And so it's a little bit more common. People that don't have that amount of courage or that level of morality or that level of, values in them acting out, and they live by those things. And so I wanted to just do something a little bit different than what we've been doing and just talk about this issue of influence and who should we allow to influence our lives? Who are the heroes? What is an anti-hero in reality? And who are we supposed to look up to in life? Who are the valuable ones to look up to? And so scripture that came into my mind when I was doing this just kind of just sends in the right direction. It's not necessarily the scripture itself, more just the statement that's made. Paul says, join one another in following my example, brothers, and this is the part that I was locked on to, is carefully observe those who walk according to the pattern we set for you. And so he's making the people reading this, he's making them be aware of who they're allowing to influence their lives and what example they're following. And so right off the bat, my very first question is, what do you think is the driving force behind influence in people's minds today? Like, what is drawing us to the people that we allow to influence us? I hope you don't have to fix that again, by the way.
No, I was just thinking from the standpoint of, your question in regards to, so we're looking at it from the standpoint of what draws people to certain influences. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. Specifically regarding people.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a hard one to try to summarize why. I would say it depends on individuals. It's not really.
Maybe give us more than one. Like, what do you think is like?
Just generally speaking, yeah. Just so, unfortunately, I think a lot of if I'm just thinking about it from the standpoint of more general, I think a lot of what we call influence, because the first thought that comes to my mind is the idea, which is the latest, idea, is influencers, people who they are influencers. And so I know that sounds obvious, but people are, influenced by influencers, and influencers' purpose really is to be popular. And so you have this, you can go back, I'm not an expert in these, but just some of my own experience of, you had the classic, YouTube influencers back in the early days of it, PewDiePie and
Wow,
what's his name? Come on, Dave. What's the
not Mr. Beast?
Beast, Beast, yeah. Mr. Beast, and these people they're really driven to be popular. And when I say popular, I'm not talking about satisfying an ego thing as much as the drive to have influence, and that's I think what fuels a lot of social media in general, is this idea of, I want my life to have influence on other people. And so what it comes down to, what can I do in order to have influence on the most amount of people. And I think that that is sort of the driving force, of today, of influence. So the internet is really the town square of days gone by. And so what I mean by that is that what used to influence people before, was people that did things, that stood out, because some of the things you're talking about, those people are not influencers as much as they are. This is a hard category to break down because my mind is going in so many different directions with this, because I think of people like Lance Armstrong.
Yeah.
And here's somebody who's, famous, for being superhuman, being able to achieve what other humans couldn't achieve. Not like Olympic athletes. The idea was to be like Olympic athletes, but he wasn't. He was doping. And so he's lost all of that. Right. They've literally taken all of his Tour de France. They're all lost. So all of his, he's got, all these, accolades behind him that have basically been erased because he didn't actually achieve those things, according to the rules. And so, but I think about it, and I think over time, it's like, how far back do we go? And what do we call reality, and what do we call fantasy? That's the difficult thing, because I would say today, for the most part, they're influenced by influencers. In other words, there's a desire for popularity. There's a craving for popularity. And so following popular people has a sort of, virtual, influence on ourselves. Is if we're following the popular people, then we must be part of the popular people. Even though nobody knows who we are, we're part of the in crowd. And so because we're part of the in crowd, then we'll allow those people to influence us because they're part of the in crowd. And so we're willing to, to follow, those kinds of people because of popularity. Popularity, it's a what's the word? Vicariously. It's being vicariously popular because you're in the know. So if you meet anybody who's obviously following the popular people, you'll be able to have an intelligent conversation, a knowledgeable, not intelligent, a knowledgeable conversation. Oh, did you see this video? Did you hear this statement? Did you see this, thing? Did you hear about this?
Right.
You're the and sometimes you can become part of groups like Patreon and things like that, where you can get to know things because you're a paid member and other people don't know. And so, these things are helping to set the standards in your life because they are popular. And so I would say, generally speaking, I would say and I'm not saying it's a good thing by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think it's a good thing. Because I think there's something that's lost in the process, and what's lost in the process is genuine heroism. A genuine somebody who's worth following, somebody who's worth coming under their influence. Yeah. Because these are people that are only that way on camera, and they it's like to use the example of Mr. Beast, for example. He's got his fingers in so many different pies, and he's doing so many different things, and he puts a lot of effort and energy, and he genuinely does his best with what he has, and he's genuinely trying to achieve something. But at the end of the day, what is he achieving? That's the thing, is that once, if for some reason YouTube disappeared, that would be pretty much the end of his influence.
Yeah.
Unless you want to buy his chocolate, and so it's like, or his other snacks, but these are, I call that merch, which is what YouTubers do, it's just his own brand of merch, and so, So, and I'm not trying to put any of this down. That's not my point. My point is that I think that that is what is influencing society, is things that don't matter, but they're popular. They're not really substantial, but they're popular.
So, what do you think? What else? What are some things that like drive, or what are some things that like influencers use to capture popularity? Like what do you think interests? I could go after like a demographic. What do you think are like the interests of young people? What are the interests of, the young adult? What are the
Yeah.
things that are
Yeah,
attracting
I
their
would say
attention
in
to that?
general, I think people just in general have a very genuine lack of direction, in their lives. And I attribute that, and it's true. It's true, but it's really, looked at with disdain because, people are victims and everything. But, this, having so many children outside of marriage, and so there's no commitment between the man and the woman to start with in terms of staying together, and then but having the benefits, and then a kid comes along, and they're not really, it's usually somebody usually gets stuck raising the kid. It's not so much I'm going to raise the kid because I have this desire to do that, because that wasn't the original intent. This is damage control, and that affects the child. And it affects many, many, many children. That children being born out of wedlock. You look at there's statistics that people don't want to look at because they tell the truth, and we don't like the ideas. But the bottom line is that the reason why third world countries are third world countries is often is the sexual promiscuity. They're having kids outside of marriage. They'll have kids from many different women. They're all over the place, and these kids are not being raised by anybody. They're just being brought into the world and given subsistence. Just barely enough to get them to make it from day to day, and they usually end up having to take on responsibility that they are not even ready for, and then these things get propagated, as time goes on, because it's what and now you're in a position to where your life sucks, because you've never really been able to develop the skill sets that you need to be able to be successful in life. So what do? You reproduce the same thing that you hated growing up, in other people, and so other children, and it just keeps propagating. And that's a lot of the reason why we have these issues of poverty and all these kinds of things. But nobody wants to address those kinds of issues, because those are issues that are their Christian issues, their religious, their morals, their ethics. They're the kinds of things that we can't go there, because we like the idea of those who are of means, are able to they're able to they're able to pay in order to ditch the consequences for the bad decisions they're making in life. And so it's sad. I mean, to me, it's really sad. But I think that really is, when it comes right down to it, is the parents are supposed to be the hero figures for the children, and that's missing. So they've got to find it somewhere else. And where are they going to find it? When you're 16 years old, where are you going to find it? You can find it at school, in teachers. But the whole, particularly in America, the education system in America is so bogged down with, again, this same idea of, we need to get kids ready for the real world, because their parents aren't getting them ready, and so we've got here the same propagating, it's a problem that continues to propagate itself, is that you have kids, they have no direction in life, and so they're being thrown into the public schools, and the teachers are being demanded, you teach this child how to have a good life. It's like, I'm supposed to teach them how to get, to give them an education. I'm not supposed to teach them how to give them a good life. And so you have this great loss, of direction. And, today, having the sixth grade graduation for, my, for Adriana, my granddaughter, and looking at, after it was over and watching these kids and watching these parents, because they were playing music, and these parents, you can tell that these parents are nightclub people. You can tell they're dancing and they're making all the moves like they're in a nightclub dancing, and their kids are dancing with them and stuff like that. And it's like, here we go. We've got this thing going on. Here you're a parent, and let me ask the question. You're a parent. What are you doing in a nightclub? You did that was your scene when you were younger, when you were single, but now you're responsible. You're raising a child. It's there's a time where you have to put that stuff away and get to the business of taking care of, raising your kid, and I know, because I was raised in that kind of an environment. So I know what I'm talking about firsthand, and I know what it's like when you make the decision as a parent to be responsible, what happens. And I'll tell you, being responsible as is, or learning to be responsible, is probably one of the greatest benefits, gifts, let me put it that way, one of the greatest gifts you could ever give to yourself and everyone that follows after you, is learning that responsibility should trump, your own, indulging in your own passions, and so I think, I think that's kind of where it all lies, is that the kind of influence that people are having is not a good one.
Yeah.
Generally speaking.
So if we were to try, because we're kind of, from the perspective of like the outside looking in, and almost thinking top down, like the influencer toward the influenced. But if you were to try and take a stab at, like, let's just say the psychology of the influenced, the one who is being influenced, what is it in us that is, searching, whether we have direction or not, what is it that we are searching for?
Well, I don't
that's
think
so attractive.
Yeah, I don't think we have direction, quote unquote, when it comes to that. I've met very few people that have direction, that they know, that they really do have a general idea of where they're going in life. Some people do, and they're usually people who are successful.
Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about. Like, clearly you have.
I mean, they're
we've talked
notably
about,
successful.
We've talked
they
about,
have cars and houses, and stuff like that.
So, but you've talked about, we've talked quite a few times in this podcast about things that have influenced you over the years. But you have an aim. You have a direction that you're going in life, right? And so you could state pretty clearly, like, okay, you've made decisions on who you allow to influence your life, because you know where you want to go. Yeah. And so when you're taking that from, like, okay, apply the same question to, like, or the same thinking to somebody who doesn't have direction. Let's just think, like I said, the demographics would kind of determine a lot of that. Yeah. But I mean, well, I don't know, actually, what you just mentioning about parents at the graduation and stuff like that. Maybe there's not a lot of difference. Well, it's at all
levels now. I mean, it really is. It's at all levels. Because I hate to put it into a context of, because it's not relative to my age group. Yeah. Because it's not like my age group had it together and then everybody below that doesn't have it together. That's not true. People my age group are still going, like, we have the, in Redwood City, we have the, the music on the square, and I still see people my age going out, in their 60s, getting drunk like they were when they were 20, and dancing like when they were 20, and not realizing that most of the 20-year-olds that are there that night are looking at them, and they don't even know the music that's being played. They don't even know the songs because they're so old and outdated. And, and these are, the parents reliving their rock and roll fantasies. And so, it's tragic to see that, that this is what a younger generation has to look forward to. So it's at all levels. I'm not talking from the standpoint of that, that I think that there's an age group that has got it together and everybody's just degrading from down there. It's just all gone away. It's like the idea of actually being something is almost, I feel like, and I can't speak for the entire world, but my experiences, particularly in the United States, is that we've kind of given up on the idea, I think, of ever being anything, you know. And so the idea of it's become, it's, you know, it's kind of an old fashioned word, but it's hedonism is basically what it is just do what feels good,
Yeah.
you know. And so influencers capitalize on that. They want to show, you know, the lifestyles of the rich and famous, you know, kind of a thing. You know, this is what I do because I have all this money, and you can do it too if you can be an influencer like me, you know. But at the end of the day, what are you actually doing? You know, what is it that you're doing that's actually productive and helpful, you know, in building a future generation? It's really not. There's nothing of any real level there, you know, that you know is I think helpful. And it's not all doom and gloom, because I do really think the answer is, you know, and hopefully this will be something that it will trend and become a surge at some point. Is that I was hearing an article, or I think I read it. I can't remember if I listened to it, but talking about that there's a resurgence, and it's not really a resurgence because of the demographic, but you know, millennials and Gen Zers and below are actually giving church an opportunity. You know, they're actually going to church and giving church an opportunity, which in some ways is unfortunate, because so many churches are they're just as lost in the past as the parents that attend them, that are the same ones that are down in the square dancing and all that, and it doesn't make a blind bit of difference. But that is the answer. You know, that is the solution. Is, you know, the church that's biblically based. You know, a return to morality, a return to, you know, ethics that are based on absolutes. You know, getting some references. You know, some reference points, solid reference points. We use words like foundation and cornerstone, you know, to talk about, you know, reference points. Well, you those are absolutes. You know, you can't have a reference point that's relative to something else, because it's not a reference point anymore, because a reference point has to be able to stand alone, so it has to be absolute by definition. And so if we want to build a foundation in our lives, if we want reference points for our lives, we have to have something that's unchanging. And that thing that's unchanging is the original church of the first century, of the, you know, of the type that is demonstrated in the book of Acts, which sadly many people have abandoned the Bible, have abandoned the truth of the Word of God. But at the same time, you know, there's actually a scripture in the Bible that says, don't remove the ancient landmarks. And the reason is because those are reference points. Those are absolutes. You know, these landmarks are there for a reason. They're there to indicate something. You know, you can't just move them wherever you want. You know, if you're a homeowner, you know this very well. If your neighbor, you know, if you're living in a fairly populated, densely populated city, and your neighbor decides that he wants to turn his single car garage into a double car garage, and that's going to mean that he's going to take up 5 feet of your property, we wouldn't say, oh well, you know, it's all relative, you know, so feel free. You know, it'd be like, no, this is the boundary. You know, these are the landmarks, and you can't build past this. And so sorry, no, you can't. Unless you want to buy that piece of property from me, you know, you're not going to just build over the top of me. It's not going to happen. You know, so we understand that reference points are important, especially landmarks, you know, but when it comes to the issues of morality, where we don't want there to be landmarks, where we don't want there to be reference points, well, now those are up for negotiation, and nobody has a right to impose a landmark like that on my life. But the problem is that if you want a foundation, you have to have landmarks, and landmarks have to be absolute. You can't. There's no such thing as relative truth. It's not truth anymore if it's relative.
So, what do you think are some like I'm trying to drill down to more like some specifics of like what behind the thing, like for example, some of the things that I'd kind of put down were like the issue of belonging. We've talked before about identity, and you know, the need to identify with something and be identified with something.
Yeah.
And then, you know, stuff like status, and you'd mentioned a little bit about that, about like the being in the know because you're paying attention to what's popular and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So what is the desire driving those things? That's kind of what I'm after. Is like, what is the thing that's
Well, this sense of feeling like, your life has meaning. That's the driving force behind most of the decisions that we make in life. Is, what is there that gives me meaning in life? And the reality is the direction the world is going, in terms of all the things that I talked about, all the negative things that I talked about, is there's a clear reason why everything is going in that direction, is because if there is no God, then there's no eternal life, and if there is no eternal life, then there's only this life, and if there's only this life, well, this life is going to end for everybody. And so if this life is going to end for everybody, then what's the point of having meaning in the first place? The reason why we can't find meaning is because there is no meaning. And that is the logical regression of a society that has given up on God. Is that whole idea is there is no eternal life, there's only the here and now, and the here and now is all about making the most of it. And if making the most of it, I can't waste my time being an example for other people. Because by the time I'm finished being an example for other people, I'm dead. And there's no reason to remember me, because I've just been spending my life being an example, and I've never really enjoyed life for myself. And so it's like, when we're listening to those speeches today, there's a number of speeches, and it's like I'm listening to these speeches, and I'm thinking the whole thing, is these are how old are they? 12, 11-year-old, 11, 12-year-olds,
10, 11, 12.
And here they are being told, you've got your whole future ahead of you, the world is your oyster, and don't be afraid of the future because it's yours to achieve, and all these lofty platitudes. But I'm thinking, most of these kids, because there was a handful of kids that got awards, right? And it's like, I don't know how many kids there were. There were probably at least 150,
Like 70,
somewhere.
75 or something like that. Actually.
Was it that little?
Yeah, just the graduating
Oh
class.
wow! I thought I was being conservative. Yeah. Okay. So 75, because I know there are 3 classes, but I thought there was 30, 35 kids in class. But anyway, so the whole idea is, looking at this and thinking, out of these, 10 kids got, awards roughly, and so looking at this and it's like, so 1/3 of the kids got rewards, but 2/3 of the kids didn't get anything but a thing that said you made it to 6th grade.
Yeah.
And so they're going to go home, and they got their picture. You made it to 6th grade, but it's not a relation based on any achievement really, other than the fact that they didn't fail 5th grade. And so it's like I passed. So are you a C student? Are you a D student? Are you, what are you? Are you even ready for 6th grade? And, and then when you get to high school, are you still going to be in the game?
Do you think society has just set things up in such a way where we don't really even grade things in the
Well,
correct manner?
no, we just want to pass people along, make them feel good about themselves, because life doesn't have any meaning, and that really is, so in a lot of ways, what we're seeing happen in the world, and anybody who's looking at the world thinking, man, the world I'm inheriting, especially if you're, Gen Z or millennial, and you're looking at this, look at what I've inherited here, such garbage. Well, listen, welcome to reality. Is that this is the direction that the world is going, and the reason for that is because the world has forgotten God. The world has pushed God to the side and has decided we don't need God, we don't need there to be a God. And it's all wishful thinking anyway. Well, that's the result, and you will follow along with that. When you are, when you're millennial and Gen Z, people, when you become the baby boomer of the day, you'll be the same way. You'll be just as responsible, and I mean responsible in terms of, accountability for the damage of the world as anybody else, because you have to learn the most critical element of life is that, influence is more than just popularity. You have to be willing to set an example for other people that are going to come after you.
So what do you think that does for like the psyche of people? Like what is that creating in our thinking that clearly is making it to where we don't even really know how to identify good people versus bad people?
Yeah. Well, so as a
'Cause
real,
you mentioned you talked about how like the morals of the
Yeah,
Bible and
yeah,
stuff like that are no longer even.
yeah, as a real Christian who has been so for 42 years and has been a pastor for 30 of those years, 32 of those years, and having traveled the world and have seen both the positive and the negative effects of sin. I shouldn't say positive effects of sin, but the positive effects of repentance from sin and the negative effects of people who remain in sin, is that I have watched, and it's literally it's a line, it's a line down the middle. The people that turn away from sin are the ones that they take the path of success and they begin to propagate a generations of people living meaningful lives, because they believe in God, they believe in eternity, they believe in a life after, and so they are generating valuable exemplary lives, and like I said, they're reproducing generations of people with meaning and purpose in life, and then you have this other group that they're not really doing anything. They're a mishmash. They're like, so it's a difference between, and try to keep your ego out of this and just listen to things from the standpoint of rationale, is that you have a group of people that are their focus is on purity, being pure. The other group focuses on being impure. And so obviously, when you talk about a focus on purity and a focus on impurity, you're talking about automatically creating a disaster, when you're talking about impurity. And that's the thing is that so people come into the church, they make a decision to follow Christ, and they after a while they realize, what, this is I'm not really excited about the idea of living for eternity, because I don't even know what eternity is going to look like, and so I'm not even sure that I'm going to be excited about eternity. But this life I can see, I can feel, I can touch. And so they go back to their sin. They go back to the way they were. And it doesn't matter, it could be 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years. It doesn't matter how long. They go right back to their sin. They go right back and they pick up where they left off. And it's just a meaningless life. But for them, that life is freedom. And the reason why it's freedom is because they don't care the influence of their lives on other people anymore. They've given up on that idea. They may have children, but they don't care about their influence. They may have family members, but they don't care about their influence. They don't care about other people. They only care about themselves. And so and then they propagate that into other generations, if there is any other generations. It's just uncaring people, and it's funny because that group is the one that talks the most about how much they care, but yet they're living their lives are so immoral, and unproductive in terms of being able to generate purpose and meaning in life for other people, that it's almost laughable, because you have this other group here they're focusing on purity. They're not chanting about how sensitive everybody should be to everybody else. What they're doing is they're busy about the business of being a good example to other people, and actually doing it, where the other people are only complaining about other people who don't take their point of view, and how compassionate they are. It's just the whole idea. There's so many levels of this, to me, that looking at this is like, when you're talking about kids having, parents who not only allow but encourage their kids to change their gender, and they're like not even fully grown yet, and it's like, what are you thinking? What if when their brains begin to mature, as adults, and they realize that you were the one, that endorsed this insanity in their lives, and now they can't go back. You've destroyed any hope of them being able to go back to normalcy, because they can't go back. It's quite clear that you don't go back when you start down that road of changing gender. You're making a permanent decision from A to B, and going you're already losing something going from A to B, and when you try to go back from B to A, you lose even more again. And so it becomes a thing of where you can't even be who you are. And the shocking thing to me is many of these people that are at that point in their life, especially those who want to go from B to A again, they're in their late 20s, so they've still got their whole lives ahead of them, it's sometimes even early 20s when they want to go back, and they've got their whole lives ahead of them, but they've already destroyed everything. Sometimes they can't reproduce anymore, they can't have children, they can't build families, they can't do any of those things anymore. The ideas and thoughts that were going on in their heads when they were little kids, 15, 16 years old, I mean literally still little kids in so many ways, and now here they are, because somebody somewhere that should have been an influence in their life didn't say, listen, why don't you wait? Not, no, you shouldn't do this. Why don't you wait? And listening to the naysayers, no, they're going to commit suicide, they're going to kill themselves, this, that, and the other thing. If you don't allow them to change their gender, and and all this kind of stuff, it's like, well, you're talking about the fact that you have a lack of influence over your own kid. I mean, that's what you're looking at. Your kid's looking at you. They don't see you as an influence. They don't trust you. You're out at the nightclubs. You're out drinking. You're out partying. And you're going to give them advice for their future? And they're looking at that saying, no, mom's just as crazy and dad's just as crazy as anybody else. Why should I?
But why go that route? I was just thinking about that as you're saying this right now. I was listening to this account of Time Magazine. I didn't know this, but Time Magazine actually declared in 1938 they made Hitler Man of the Year.
Yeah.
Did you know that? In 1939,
well,
it was
I've heard
Joseph Stalin.
stories, yeah.
And then
yeah, because at the time,
like why put somebody up and then give them a title like that? Like why idolize something that's so wrong?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't. No, you've
Not
missed
idolize,
the.
not
Yeah,
idolize.
you've missed. That's a jumping to conclusions problem, really, because you're looking at somebody who's having influence, and then what you're saying is that all influence is good, and so it sells. It sells magazines, so you're pointing out the fair point that I'm trying to make is it's not like this problem just started. We've had problems all along with the idea of influence and its disconnection from morality, that there are lines that are being crossed. And when you look backwards and you look at what happened, especially during that time, of Hitler's rise to power, it was a power vacuum. That this is the issue, is that people were not willing to make the hard choices in order to achieve things. And so you have, you look and, these guys they were your classic influencers. They came to power because they had a base of people that were following them and were helping them to implement their ideas and ideals. And so that's what you're looking at, is you're looking at these people that they got, because you look at the whole thing, here's, it's so crazy because here's this world power, England, that, had the British Empire, you have this huge influence in the world, huge influence in the world, but had lost backbone. Under Neville Chamberlain, just lost backbone. And, watching immoral things happen, watching a country take other countries, and saying, well, we kind of did the same thing. Well, okay, you did the same thing, but what was the mistake? Was the mistake taking over the country, or was the mistake how you went about it? Or was it a mistake at all? Is what Hitler doing the same thing? Is it just these kinds of judgment calls of just trying to determine what is the morality of what's happening here, and not not gonna get involved in this. Let's just see if we can't get a peace treaty signed so they won't come after us. And it's like, but when you look at it and you look what was happening during that time, the known information, not the behind the scenes information. When you look at the known information, and even you look at World War One under Kaiser Wilhelm, where there's still this. You look at it and you think there's still this very clear desire for world domination. That there's a desire for world power, world domination that's being played out here. And okay, yeah, a lot of countries were doing that. England was involved in that same kind of thing. You had so you have the Persian Empire. I'm just trying to go back as far as we can go back. I mean, there's farther you can go. Persian Empire. You have different empires. Byzantine. Different. You have Roman, and then you have British Empire. So you have these empire building periods of time, but yet at the same time you have your things are starting to with World War One, the whole idea is, okay, we need to be careful with this. We're going to kill the whole world. We're no longer looking at taking countries, and building empires by acquisitioning countries. We're now talking about something where it's there's fighting going on over world domination, and it's like, okay, we need to be careful, and so I know I'm oversimplifying history, but at the same time it's quite clear that these were the issues, and the truth is if you go back, you can go back even further into the 1800s, the whole Enlightenment. We're already starting to say there is no God, and now we're paying the price for that, because there is no God. If there is no God, then what is morality, and what do we define as morality, and whose morality, is the proper morality? If there's no external morality, then who gets to decide? Is it the most powerful nation or nations, allies, what is it? Because you look at World War II, and the outcome of World War II, and the whole moving of things because at that time, Russia was, were they an ally? Weren't they an ally? They were for the most part an ally, but maneuvering, for taking advantage of when everything, when it comes time to buying hotels, where are you going to put hotels? And so you have that begin to show there, but there was a lot of during that period of time there was a lot of alliances that were for convenience, but we knew that these people were bad news. We knew that these particular alliances were not, they were not alliances based on ideology. They were alliances based on advantage, strategic advantage. And so having military might from Russia to fight against Germany was important. And being able to push back, the German occupation, and so that. But there's a this. I'm not just giving a history lesson here. The whole idea is that we're looking at today, the idea of influence, and who are the role models. It's the same dilemma. It's the same problem. Is what's going to be the foundation, for what decides what a role model is. My generation complained about Hollywood, as a bad role model. That look at Hollywood. Who are these people? They're nobodies. A lot of them got liberal arts degrees at various colleges, but they've been pushing for getting into Hollywood since they were young. And many times their parents were the ones pushing them into doing this. You have you have another generation. It's a lot of Hollywood kids. We talk about church kids. You've got Hollywood kids. These are kids that were grown up in Hollywood. They have no idea what real life is like because they have grown up in Hollywood life. And the amount of damage and things that go on that are constantly being covered up with money, and lawyers and things like that, and just the corruption and all the scandals and things that go on in Hollywood. And you look at this and you have these. I think of these people that are like they're in Hollywood and they're like the moral beacons. That's not the word I'm looking for. Lighthouses. Just a handful of lighthouses. I mean, it's not a whole lot. Trying to stand out there and be lighthouses is like. I don't even know if that's even worthwhile, because it's like, you maybe it is worthwhile because, there's a Hollywood has a group of real people who are really jacked up, just like everywhere else in the world. And so, having a light, in the darkness is always a good idea. So I probably shouldn't take that too far. But my point in all that is the issue of foundation. What are you building? What is the foundation? What is the absolutes, that you're gonna build upon, that's going to determine, influence, that's going to be helpful, to people.
So I got a question that came in. I apologize, it came in a little while ago, but that the timer's blocking the bottom of the chat. I didn't even realize it was that bad. The question is there a possibility of a need for attention or approval that people look up to media influencers or become influencers?
Well, this is the thing we're talking about is that is the, I don't think it really matters what the personal influence is, because it could be different for different people, whether, it's, ego or, self-esteem or, they're all related to each other. But I think the more important thing to understand is that we're talking about a vacuum, really is what we're talking about. And that's why you have these kinds of things. And that's why somebody like Hitler can become man of the year, is because you have a vacuum, a morality vacuum, or Stalin, these people. Because it's not like anything has changed. You still have those kinds of people as man and woman of the year. I remember, was it Caitlyn Jenner, the woman of the year? It's like what does that say to biological women? That it took a biological male to show you what it means to be a real woman. And the truth is that, listen, let's be honest here. Why did that happen? It sells magazines. It's not, because it's not about morality. It's not about trying to be sensitive to, a changing world. It's listen, I lived outside of the United States for 15 years, and I will tell you that when you live outside of the United States for 15 years and then you come back, you realize that what drives the majority of the things that we champion is cash. It's cash. It's not sensitivity to people and helping people. It's cash. And that's why, you've seen these companies that have been boycotted, because they have put out these, really, really, really far leaning, way over, catering to a very, very, very small people group. And the outrage, of the general popularity, and you have these boycotts of their products or going to their stores or things like this. And it's not just by Christians, it's by mainstream people, and the reason is because these companies are thinking, let's just take a chance, and see what happens, see if we can't get a momentum, going, of something trendy or new,
Yeah.
So let's just go way out there. We can always come back because they know that. We can always come back. Yeah, okay, our profits may tank for 2 or 3 quarters, but we can always bring it right back. Because when they, it's funny, they talk about companies losing billions of dollars. They're not losing billions of dollars. It's not real money that they lose. They lose the value of their stock. The value of their stock falls by billions of dollars. But they just have to turn around tomorrow and do something that scratches people's back, and it comes right back. Because value is a perception thing. It's not reality. It's just a perception. When it comes to the stock market, that's the thing. What you got to be careful with stocks and buying stocks is that if you're buying stock, you have to realize that you're buying a stock if you're going to buy stock in a company, you want to buy stock in a company that gives the perception of being stable, but being able to grow. That they're not crazy, not going to go out there and do something really amazing, insane. And so. Or they've got a very long track record and they can try a few insane things, like some. But it's just. But the whole idea and talking around trying to get different facets of the same problem is that at the end of the day, heroes, genuinely speaking, there's a vacuum for heroes, and anti-heroes. I'm not sure exactly what that means, because, well, first of all, which I don't think you mean this, but, an anti-hero anti also means before, not just against.
Yeah.
And so, before heroes, is this, somebody before a hero, or would that have a difference of take, or is anti-heroes really, talking about villains, the idea of genuine villains? And so, how far do you take that? These are people that oppose heroes, or are they infamous? They're
to clarify,
they're heroes. They're heroes because they are, like the Joker becomes a hero.
Yeah. No. So to clarify, I chose anti-hero on purpose because it's a little bit more, like I said, common. It's not necessarily people that are villains per se, but they're just people who aren't courageous. They don't think of in way like you're talking about, in the middle of the podcast, talking about like they're not thinking of ways how I can influence people for good.
Right.
They're not thinking that way. They don't think self-sacrifice for the good of others.
Right.
They don't think that way.
Yeah, okay.
That's just, they live for themselves. They'll exemplify cowardice at times, but only because to do that would not serve me. And so it's almost like this selfish version. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily a villain per se, but it's not a hero. That's the point.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so from that standpoint, most of what I've described is anti-heroism.
Yeah. Exactly.
That is the rule of the day.
That as the thing that people look up to the most nowadays.
Well, but it's the rule of the day because it's much easier. It's much easier to be a pretend hero than it is to be a real one. And like I said, the other thing, which is, it's a funny thing about being a Christian for as long as I've been, and I need to use the term real, authentic, because it's not, I'm not talking about the Christian brand, of Christianity, the brand, which is really popular. It fills stadiums with people swaying to religious music. I'm not talking about that, because those same people are, like I said, they're the parents that are going to the nightclubs. They're the same kind of people, but they feel, they're really feely people, and they're and they really genuinely don't care what their kids do. And when I say don't care, I mean that from the standpoint of that they feel that's a good thing to not care. I give my children the liberty to be able to do. The truth of the matter is you do that because it's easier. You don't do that because you are so big-hearted and you've somehow tapped into the inner psyche of your child. It's just the opposite. Is you don't want to have the least bit of inconvenience in your own life, so you're willing to roll with the punches, whatever those punches may be, and whatever it means accepting, and it's like, I'm I want to be the popular parent because it's easier, and so I want my kid to be able to bring over their friends and have all of them like me, and actually, when they have sleepovers, they'll invite me to come and sleep with them,
Yeah.
that kind of a thing. It's like it's totally the path of least resistance. Totally. There's nothing of effort or energy or understanding or logic or reason or anything beyond just your own deceived self-perception. And it is the easiest of the easiest way. And that's, and it reproduces itself, and so there is no hero culture
Yeah.
anymore outside of the truth of the gospel. That's the only real genuine hero culture, is it within the Christian, the genuine, the authentic Christian community. And the reason why I say it that way is because that is what they're doing. There's a desire. I've been holding my tongue. It's 8:00 now. I almost made it, but I'm dancing around. I'm talking about this tomorrow night in my sermon. I'm going to be preaching on the issue of responsibility tomorrow. Oh, and that reminds me, I've been so busy with things that I forgot to put up our YouTube thumbnail for tomorrow. But that is, so I'll have to put that up. Yeah.
So it's 8:00, and I guess the question, you've talked about it already, in bits and pieces, but maybe you can just summarize quickly what what is a real hero? What does that look like?
A real hero is a person who lives in such a way so that other people can follow them and also be heroes. And that's not a full definition because we haven't defined what a hero is per se, but it's the idea of, you have to have that as the framework, and that a hero is a propagating thing that has to be there, but also the idea is that it is people who have a solid foundation and know where they're going and have meaning and purpose in their life, not theoretically, but realistically, actively, and it's not limited to super people. Everybody can be a good influence. That's the thing I think is interesting. My whole family labors to be a good influence, and I'm talking about my wife, my children, and to their children and their spouses, and for the most part, it would be nice if it was 100%. But the whole idea is I want to be able to set a standard so that my kids, when they grow up, they will have meaning and purpose in their lives, like I do. And so for those who don't have meaning or purpose in their lives, that's you're currently excluded from being a hero. You are not a hero, but that doesn't mean you cannot become a hero. But you have to desire to become a hero. Either that or a hedonistic, and that's really what it comes down to, an anti-hero. So either you choose to be a hero, and you live and you develop an exemplary life by discovering meaning and purpose for your own life, a legitimate meaning and purpose that can be propagated down into future generations, or you're an anti-hero and you're just living for self. And whatever, like, let me just give the best case scenario. You're living for self. You worry about yourself and how well you're doing. You make sure you've got plenty of ibuprofen so you don't have headaches. You are able to live your life in such a way where when you have problems, you go into your little shell and remedy yourself, do whatever is necessary, take away time and effort and energy from the world around you so that you can feel good about yourself. And then once you feel good about yourself, you've got your own little cave, that you go into every now and then, because you're an anti-hero. You know, heroes don't have caves. You know, that doesn't mean that heroes don't find themselves in caves, but heroes don't have caves. They don't have caves that they retreat to during times of difficulty. They are but they may find themselves in a cave, and their goal is to get out of that cave as fast as possible. You know, so that they can get back to the business of being a hero.
Yeah.
You know, so in the true sense of the term.
Very cool. Well, that's it for tonight. We will have something a little different next week, just for those who are going to be tuning in. We won't be here in the local area for a podcast, and so we are going to add a link for the event going on at our annual Bible conference. I really do encourage you to tune into that if you're a regular viewer. Highly beneficial to tune into that. They're always very good, and so we will put the link in for that. The following week we will not have a podcast, but we'll put an update up just in a thumbnail, or in way of a thumbnail, just so folks see that. But if you're listening now or after the fact, you want to throw comments in, we do view those comments. Suggest questions that you have, or things that you'd like to see on the podcast, or, maybe subjects you'd like us to follow. We're open for that. Love to have your input and feedback, and invite somebody to see these and send out the link. We really do appreciate your guys' viewership, and we'll see you guys later.